Recorded.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Flaspohler, and I appreciate you being here with us this morning. We're going to spend about an hour talking about some budgeting and some advanced financial strategy and planning for ambulance districts. So, as I said, this session is being recorded. We're going to make it available through Prodigy EMS, so that if your board members weren't able to attend today, they should be able to log in and attend there, and be able to get the credit and the certificate, because this does count for continuing education. So I'm going to go ahead and
Yes.
share my screen here. So hopefully everyone can see that. Looks like there's about 41 people online today. So thank you guys for all coming out and joining us. As I said, today we're going to talk about financial strategy and risk management. My name is Frank Flaspohler. I'm the attorney for EMS Legal Services, and this webinar is being offered in partnership with the Missouri Ambulance Association, which is celebrating its 30th year this year. So I certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with MAA in helping provide this education. Because it's provided and jointly sponsored by the Missouri Ambulance Association, this hour does qualify for continuing education as 1 hour of continuing ed for ambulance district board members, because as you may recall, board members now have to get 3 hours of continuing ed each term, or roughly 1 hour per year. And then also, this will qualify for ambulance district administrators, because our service administrators also have some continuing ed requirements. Specifically, they have to get 2 years, or 2 years. I'm sorry, 2 hours each year, unless, of course, they're in the getting their initial training, that 40-hour program to begin with. And then there were some other ways. If you're not aware, the State Advisory Council has also published a list of other programs out there that qualify to fulfill that 40-hour requirement. So if you haven't seen that, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you a copy of the State Advisory Council resolution that outlines those. There are programs like Fitch and Associates, firefighter officer programs, just some different management programs that the State Advisory Council has determined fulfill that 40-hour initial training requirement for administrators. So as I said, my name's Frank Flaspohler. This is my great, formal picture of, all lawyers, I guess, stand in front of bookcases for a picture. When I took this picture, I tried to talk the photographer into, going outside or standing somewhere more fun. And he said, "Oh no, this is what lawyers do. We all stand in front of books." So those are really old books. I never read those. They're from like the 1800s, but nonetheless, that's my formal lawyer picture. This is the much more fun part of my life. I always like to introduce you guys to my kids and my wife. And so they're in the middle. Those are my 6 kids. They're the ones all in the black shirt, along with my grandmother, their great grandmother, who still has a lot of fun with them. And so we've got Frankie and Gracie and Abby, Eleanor and Henry and Madison. All were really excited there to visit great grandma, which she lives right down the road from us. So they get to do pretty frequently. And then, of course, I wouldn't have any of those kids without my partner and spouse, Katie. Katie is also an EMT. She works for Howard County Ambulance and has been doing that for about 2 years. She spent the first 10 years of our marriage, obviously busy with other things. She was a stay-at-home mom with our kids up until that point. And so that's my team at home. I am certainly very blessed with the opportunity to serve so many ambulance districts and some fire protection districts and 911 centers throughout the state of Missouri, continuing EMS legal services after established by Frank Foster in the late 90s. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning about some of these really important issues in planning and maintaining financial management and stability for our ambulance districts in the state of Missouri as we continue to move forward as the leaders in pre-hospital healthcare. So some of the things I want to go over today, we're going to talk a little bit about fiduciary duty and what exactly that means to us. And fiduciary duty is kind of one of those weird legal terms that even when you're going into law school, nobody has any idea what it means. And sometimes we graduate law school and we're still not so sure. So we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning about what that special term means and how it applies to us as board members and as administrators of ambulance districts in the state of Missouri. And then we want to look at a couple cases. We don't want to just focus on the bad, but we're going to talk about a couple cases where the Missouri State Auditor in the last several years has recognized some ambulance districts that fell short in some of their financial oversight policies, just as a springboard so that we can talk about how we can improve things and go forward. And then we're going to talk about some of those best practices for financial oversight. Then we're going to talk a little bit about levies and bonds, specifically general obligation bonds and operational tax levies. And if you're not familiar with the use tax, we're going to talk a little bit about that because ambulance districts are now eligible to pursue a use tax, and we have several that have it on the ballot for the April election. We will spend a good deal of time talking about capital improvement planning and how that applies to things like fleet rotation strategies, how it applies to planning and procuring the really expensive medical equipment, the tools that we need to provide that high quality pre-hospital health care. And those oftentimes are not simply things that we can simply go, oh, well, we need a new one. Here, we're just going to write a check and get one. So really things that we need to plan out for those capital investments, looking into the years ahead so that we're not surprised and so that we have money set aside. And we'll talk a little bit about sinking funds, but how we can have those funds set aside to make sure we have that money to spend on those items when we need it. And then we're going to talk a little about insurance coverage gaps and how sovereign immunity and director and officers insurance plays into all of that. And we want to wrap up with talking about some sector level collaboration for EMS. So really how we can, in planning for the future of EMS, really look at how we can work together as certainly a team locally with the partners within our jurisdiction, but also with our neighboring partners and how we can really work on improving pre-hospital healthcare in a way that we couldn't do if we were just doing it by ourselves. So how we can collaborate going forward. All right, so let's talk about this great fiduciary duty, which is that wonderful legal term that hopefully you encountered when you took your initial 8 hours of board training, either through the Missouri Ambulance Association program or through the program offered by Monty Olson through the Missouri Fire Institute. Both really great programs, but hopefully they talked with you a little bit about fiduciary duty. This fiduciary duty is really the highest legal and ethical obligation under Missouri law. And so we see trustees have a fiduciary duty. Individuals exercising a power of attorney have a fiduciary duty. And so we want to look at what that means for us as board members and administrators. Because under Chapter 190 of the Revised Statutes of Missouri, I'm sorry, I thought I silenced that. I clearly did not. So under Chapter 190, we are entrusted with some pretty broad governmental powers for things like levying taxes, and we're going to see some of the requirements that go along with the Hancock Amendment there. But our district can also acquire real estate. We can make some really significant financial purchases, and we employ people who rely upon us for their standard of living. And so we have some really high obligations there that we need to be exercising. As I said, hopefully your introductory, that initial training program covered that. But as this is a little bit more advanced, we want to look at that a little bit more specifically. And so we want to talk about the duty of care and duty of loyalty and duty of obedience. And really what that means as we shift from kind of this mentality of just passively passing a budget or approving a budget, and then letting our administrator take care of it from there. There really is a role for the board of directors to provide some oversight, not getting into the day-to-day management of the district, but some oversight just to make sure that our administrators and our team is complying with our expectations for documentation, recording expenses, and spending according to our budget. And so we really want to look at kind of this three-part obligation here. So we start with our duty of care. It really requires individuals to exercise the judgment and diligence of a reasonably prudent person. That is the legal standard that a court would use if they're looking to you as a board member or administrator and saying, did you exercise your duty of care? It's not a passive position. It really demands some active inquiry into reviewing the financial documents. And so when we look at our kind of negative examples here in just a minute, we'll see that on occasion the board does not play a role in that oversight, and that really creates the opportunity for problems. Because even when we think we have the best administrator in the world, and certainly we hope that we all do, still providing that oversight is an essential role of us as board members, not because we don't trust them, not because we don't think they're doing a good job, but simply because it's what we do in our role in serving the district. If we have board members that possess special training in law or financial management, they are expected to use that expertise in their duties. And they should always be acting in good faith. And so that reasonable person standard, if you bring certain knowledge and experience to the board, then you have a little bit higher than just the average reasonable person standard that you need to follow. But board members are always held to that reasonable person standard. That is the default legal presumption for the role of determining the appropriate diligence for a board member. Let's look then at this duty of loyalty, which really requires that we put the district's interests first. That's prior to any conflicts of interest that we might have, anything that might pull us in a different direction. And so we want to remember there is a provision, it's in the actually the Fire Protection District chapter, but it applies to ambulance district board members as well, that prohibits ambulance district board members from being on other fire or ambulance boards. And it prohibits them from serving as the employee of another fire protection district or another ambulance district. And so that specific conflict of interest is codified in state law. And so we want to always be cognizant of that. There can be many other conflicts of interest as well that can come up. And we want to make sure that we are recognizing those when they occur. And if they are influencing us or they have the appearance that they might influence us as board members or administrators, we maybe take the opportunity to remove ourselves from that decision. So maybe not participate in the discussion or the vote on a certain topic, and let the other board members really take the role there so that it doesn't look like we're using our position as an elected official in violation of that duty of loyalty. We also want to remember that board members cannot be employed by the board for 12 months after they're serving on the district board. And so we can't go from being a board member to then immediately getting hired by the district. Finally, we want to talk about this duty of obedience, which really just requires that we comply with all the state laws, all the constitutional requirements, things like the Sunshine Law, requirements for due process, and of course our training requirement as well. And so, as you know, board members have that initial 8-hour training requirement. And as part of this program, you are completing one of your hours of continuing education requirement. And so that's one of the ways we recognize and follow that duty of obedience by complying with those expectations of state law. This ensures that your agency is following what's laid out in the law, for things like annual reporting for financial statements, and then things like avoiding unauthorized closed meetings under the Sunshine Law. And so what we want to always maintain that duty of obedience to follow the law and the directions that are given to us. So let's just look at a couple of cases that have occurred fairly recently when some of those fiduciary duties are neglected. And really just maybe take a moment to talk about the consequences of failing to uphold those standards, because it can be really severe and devastating, both for the individuals involved, but also for the district. So in 2024, and actually January of 2024, the Missouri State Auditor published a report finding that the Naylor-Neelyville Ambulance District, which is down in Butler County near the Boot Hill, if you're not familiar where that is, but had misappropriated $249,247 of district funds over the course of the last 5 years. And so they found that during those last 5 years, there hadn't been any audits that were completed. There were no budgets that were completed by the board. Specifically, the director had improperly paid himself about $173,000, paid the billing clerk, which was his wife for part of it, then his ex-wife for another part of it, but $55,000, and the board secretary, who was the administrator's mother, was paid an additional $20,000, all without board approval. And that all took place at the same time that the district actually outsourced their ambulance services to the city of Naylor. So we're spending all of this money and we'd really outsourced the day-to-day operations to someone else. That was really significant for the Naylor-Neelyville Ambulance District because their annual income was about $173,000. And so you can see how that relates in proportion to the funds that were misappropriated. There were payments for alleged election expenses when the election didn't occur, duplicate payments, bonus payments, just kind of all of these different allegations that the administrator tried to say this is what he was spending the money for, and really just no oversight by the board. And so the state auditor concluded that there were some pretty severe lack of controls and lack of oversight that resulted in that mismanagement. We also saw from June of 2020 to March of 2021, the Carroll County Ambulance District suffered some misappropriation of funds as well. And in that case, again, the Missouri State Auditor investigated that and found that it was due to the board's failure to really establish any policies for basic record management. There were no bidding policies, and there was a lot of misuse of the credit card. And so no credit card policies or oversight by the board here. There were incorrect payments made to the district administrator, both to himself and to other employees that were made without board authorization. And this case actually resulted in the administrator being charged with felony stealing, but there was never any restitution collected because the administrator passed away about a month after he was charged with the stealing. And so, again, not a good outcome for the district, but we really see kind of this lack of oversight by the board of directors. And so we just want to make sure we're preserving our role in providing that oversight. As board members, we should always carefully define our relationship with the district's administrator. And we want to do that through a written policy that outlines the administrator's authority to spend certain amounts, provided that they're consistent with our budget. And so it is completely acceptable to say, hey, our administrator can spend up to this amount. She can spend out of the budget categories. And we don't have to have an administrator coming to us as board members every month to approve things like paying the telephone bill or purchasing cleaning supplies. But we want to set those thresholds so that the administrator knows very clearly how much they are able to spend. And we still want to require there be reporting and receipts kept and documentation for all those expenses that allow for the board to review later. So we don't have to require advanced approval for all spending, but we should define clearly what levels and thresholds can be spent without advance notice, and then what documentation has to be retained as well. And so while the board doesn't need to spend its meeting reviewing every single receipt, those should be provided and as part of the board's packet to give the board the opportunity to maybe spot check those for review. So we don't need to go line by line at every board meeting because, again, part of what the board is doing, right? You hopefully remember that from your initial training, is setting the vision for the district. And we can't do that if we're focused on the super detailed minutia of the financial management, but we want to maintain our role as providing that oversight to ensure compliance. And so always we want to trust but verify compliance with the statutory requirements, like things for annual filing, but also for compliance with our definition that we've codified in a written policy so everybody knows what it says, of how and what administrators can spend money on without advanced approval. If our agency is using a credit card, then we certainly want to ensure we have a credit card policy that outlines who is authorized to use that card and what documentation should be retained. That policy should also clarify who is authorized to increase the monthly limits on the card. And so if we go back to the Carroll County Ambulance District, we saw that the district administrator went in there, and I think the initial limit on the credit card was about $2,000, and somehow managed to increase that to $20,000, which then certainly allows for a lot more opportunity for financial mismanagement. And so again, those are things we want to make sure we've clarified in the district policy, that it's in writing, who's authorized to do those things. Credit card statements should also be provided for the board, to the board for regular review and oversight. Again, not that we're going to go through them line by line at every board meeting, but to allow board members to spot check it and, hey, take a look and, whoa, hold on, our credit limit here is increased significantly. Who authorized that? What happened? Why did we do that? So again, just giving the board the opportunity for that financial oversight. You may be familiar with the Hancock Amendment to the Missouri Constitution. It's codified in Article 10, Section 22A of the Missouri Constitution. It was adopted in 1980. It strictly prohibits local governments from levying any new taxes or increasing existing taxes without a majority voter approval. That's pretty basic. I think hopefully we all know we cannot increase taxes without voter approval. But perhaps more importantly for us to know or to recognize is that the Hancock Amendment also requires districts to roll back the property tax levies when our assessed property values may rise a little bit faster than inflation. And so there's a process outlined in Section 137.053 that requires ambulance districts to revise their property tax rates each year so that they produce essentially the same amount of revenue from the prior year. There can be small increases in the revenue, but those are limited to either the increase in the actual assessed value growth, the increase in the consumer price index, up to a maximum of 5%. And so out of those three different options, the revenue will only be able to increase by the lower, whichever one of those three is lower. That can create some pretty chronic structural issues for funding EMS in our state, because frequently our revenue growth, when it's limited to that assessment or CPI or that 5% level, does not keep up with the very high increase in inflationary costs of medical equipment and ambulances. And so certainly we've seen the cost of things like stretchers or monitors or ambulances astronomically increase. I think one of the figures that I saw was that the cost of a stretcher over the past 20 years has gone. Of course, we now have power load stretchers. We've got a lot better equipment, right? But we've seen the cost of that go from $4,000 or $5,000 to $70,000 or $80,000, and so it's like a 700% increase, right? And obviously, our assessed value and our CPI did not increase by 700% over that same time. And so that makes it challenging as financial managers for our district, because we've got limitations on those property taxes and how they can increase, that just don't keep pace with the increase in the expenses of the equipment that we have to purchase. Um, we also want to be cautious with new fees. There was a court case that comes to us from Marion County involving the Marion County Ambulance District, Keller versus Marion County, where the Missouri Supreme Court actually clarified for us that an increase in user fees, so increase in our rates for transport, are not subject to voter approval, provided that they are related to fees for service. And so as long as we're not increasing a universal fee that everybody in our district has to pay, then it's a user fee that is not subject to the Hancock Amendment. And so if we've got things like membership fees, and I don't think many of our ambulance districts do, but we're looking at things that increase fees that everybody pays, regardless of whether or not they use our service, then that's going to be subject to voter approval and the Hancock Amendment. But if we're just increasing our rates for transport, we can do that thanks to our case from Marion County. Finally, we want to be strategic about any voluntary rollbacks in our tax rates. Because if we voluntarily roll back our tax rate in an even numbered year, then we're legally bound to keep that lower tax rate in subsequent years. Because if we roll back in that general assessment year, which are our even years, then that locks in that rollback permanently. And I say permanently, there is a process to go back in and raise it, but it's a pretty detailed process that requires a public hearing, and then a resolution by the board providing the justification of why we're raising it back to what the voters had authorized. And that can pretty easily trigger some significant public backlash. It can also trigger a failure to comply with those really strict requirements in the form of a lawsuit that could have that set aside, and then we'd have to refund money that was collected inappropriately. And so we really just want to be cognizant of that and avoid having to use that procedure as much as possible, because it just creates the opportunity for additional liability. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between general obligation bonds and operational levies, because general obligation bonds certainly have their place for us. And of course, we remember that as ambulance districts, we actually have some special power that fire protection districts don't have. And so an ambulance district has the authority to borrow funds from a bank without going and seeking voter approval. And sometimes we've had many districts that have done that. And so they'll go in and borrow money to build a new station or do some remodeling. The downside to borrowing money is you have to have money coming in to make those loan payments, right? So from your tax levy or your operational levy, you have to be able to make those mortgage payments. That's not always possible for some agencies, especially when we're building really significant capital improvements like an entirely new station. And so those may be occasions when we want to consider a general obligation bond. The law also allows us to issue bonds for that, but it is subject to voter approval. That voter approval depends a little bit on the election cycle, but it's always a supermajority. And so if you go in the February election or in August or November of odd numbered years, then it requires a 2/3 majority. And so that would be the August and November election that's kind of in the years where we don't normally have big elections, right? Which is why it requires a more significant majority. However, if you use the April election, which of course is when all of our board members run, or you use the August or November election in even numbered years, then it only requires a 4/7 supermajority, which is about 57%. So still more than 50, still a supermajority, but not quite the 2/3 level. General obligation bonds can go out for up to 20 years. That's limited by the state statute, so you can't go further than that. And so we want to be cautious about using general obligation bonds for things that won't last for 20 years, right? We know just from the way we manage our own finances, we don't want to go and take a 5-year loan to buy groceries, because our groceries are going to run out and then we'll have to have more groceries. Likewise, we don't want to put a 20-year loan on our ambulances and purchase new ambulances when we know that it's very unlikely that they would last 20 years. And so I would be very cautious about using general obligation bonds for really anything other than capital improvements like stations or to purchase land. Um, there are some obligations that go along with those general obligation bonds. So I said they can't exceed 20 years. They also cannot exceed 10% of the district's tangible property. And so if you're working with a bonding company like Stifel or another agency, of course, they're going to have a special bond counsel that reviews that with you to make sure you comply with all of those requirements. Once it's approved by the voters, then the board actually has a fiduciary obligation to collect those annual taxes for interest payments and establish a sinking fund to help repay the principal on that bond amount. As opposed to general obligation bonds, the operational levies can provide us with a little bit more flexibility. And so we think of our operational levies as our just basic day-to-day taxing. And so we're going to talk here in just a minute about property tax and sales tax and use tax. But those operational levies really fund things like our salaries, our supplies, fuel and maintenance, and they provide for just the day-to-day operation of our district. So not just the day-to-day, also anything that's within the next several years, right? And so we should be accounting for, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, things like monitor replacement, things like stretcher replacement, those big ticket items that we may not want to just walk out and write a check for right away out of our operational budget. So we've accounted for those in the future. But it is our operational tax levies that's going to pay for those things that we use on a regular basis. Our operational levies, of course, are subject to the Hancock Amendment that we talked about earlier. And so they require voter approval through a standard ballot process. It is a simple majority. It's a simple majority of the folks that show up, right? So if you have a really low turnout, but 51% of the voters vote for it, or 50.1% of the voters vote for it, then your ballot measure passes, the tax goes into effect. No supermajority or special requirement there. Our operational levies are really a great way to match up investing money, saving money for those smaller items. I say smaller items, we're still talking about things that are tens of thousands of dollars, right? But that really feed into our capital improvement plan so that we can continue to replace our equipment, continue to maintain good equipment, but maybe not things that are going to last us for that 20-year term. Just kind of a quick breakdown to refresh your memory about those different funding mechanisms that we have for tax funding in the state of Missouri. And so certainly we have the most traditional one is property tax. And the statute tells us, of course, we can start out with a 30-cent property tax, but then we can subsequently allow the voters to exceed that. And we have several districts that do. I think all the way up to maybe we've got one that's close to $1, somewhere in the 90 cents to $1 range. And so property tax is obviously a very stable source of income, but it's limited by that Hancock Amendment. So we're not going to see regular increases or significant increases in that property tax. There is the opportunity for a sales tax, and as of last session, that opportunity increased up to a full 1% sales tax. And so, again, you have to go and get voter approval for that. But your sales tax is accompanied by a mandatory rollback on property tax. And so you can go up to that full 1%, but then for every dollar that you collect in sales tax, regardless of whether it's 1% or 5 or 0.5%, or I think we have even some districts that are at 0.25%. But regardless of what the amount you're collecting, for every dollar you collect in sales tax, it reduces that property tax by 50 cents. And so there is a mandatory property tax rollback as part of that sales tax. Again, there are many districts that have gone to a sales tax funding model because the sales tax tends to increase a little bit better with inflation. As inflation goes up, things get more expensive, people pay more in sales tax. Whereas the property tax is limited by that Hancock Amendment. I think out of the 108 ambulance districts, there are around 74 that currently utilize sales tax funding. Some of those have completely rolled back their property tax, and they don't collect any property tax anymore. There are some that do. Again, their property tax has been rolled back, but not all the way to zero. Also, last session, the General Assembly authorized ambulance districts to collect a use tax. A use tax is, some people call it the Wayfair tax, essentially an online sales tax. And so it is complementary to your sales tax. You cannot have a use tax without a sales tax, and your use tax cannot exceed your sales tax. But what it does is it imposes that sales tax that your local vendors, your local merchants are collecting. It imposes that sales tax on out of district purchases. And so we often talk about the use tax as leveling the playing field. There are quite a few ambulance districts, I don't have that exact count, that are seeking use taxes in the April election based on sales taxes that they've had around for a long time. So I know Lincoln County Ambulance District is one. I know Salt River Ambulance, Lynn County Ambulance, just several ambulances that are seeking to add that use tax onto an already existing sales tax. I also know that both Howard County and Stoddard County are seeking sales taxes for the first time. They've been property tax funded up until this point. And then there are several other districts who are seeking an increase in their sales tax from the 0.5% all the way up to the 1%. All told, the last count I had was that there were 20 ambulance districts that are seeking tax increases in the April election. And so we certainly see maybe, I think that reflects the need for additional funding in EMS. I would also point out, if your district is not currently sales tax funded, the Missouri General Assembly has quite a few bills dealing with property tax, attempting to change the way property taxes are collected or imposed. That seems to be in the sights of the General Assembly. I don't know what will happen this session, but it is certainly possible that property tax will become less and less of a stable funding source going forward. And so I would strongly encourage you to consider a sales tax if you don't already have one in place. So let's talk then a little bit about capital improvement planning, because capital improvement planning really can serve as a pretty strategic roadmap for planning our EMS agencies' future for the next 5 or 10 years, and even beyond that. As I said, when we talk about bonds, we're looking 20 years into the future. And so in the state of Missouri, capital assets are generally considered as any single item or group of items that exceeds $5,000 or has a useful life of more than 3 years. And so, of course, CMS has some of those definitions as well and we'll look at that at the next slide about what the useful life on different items of equipment are. But if we're anticipating that we're going to have a piece of equipment that we're going to continue to use for more than 3 years, then that really is a capital investment, something that we are going to keep and that we can depreciate over time. That definition obviously covers a pretty broad range of essentials in EMS. When we have cardiac monitors that are $50,000, then obviously those are capital investments. Likewise with stretchers, suction machines, even ultrasounds. All of these devices that we use on our trucks that we may not think of as capital investments really kind of can fall into that category. We do want to keep in mind it may apply to things that are lower than that amount, but because we're purchasing so many of them, so if we're getting 30 AEDs, we're spending $30,000. That is a capital investment because it is a group purchase. These capital investments really require planning in advance. And so our role as board members and our role as administrators is to help our board see that we are planning for the future to ensure that our agencies not caught off guard by the inevitable wearing out of this equipment. And then all of a sudden we have to go and unexpectedly replace these big ticket items. And so we have to be planning for that into the future. A critical component of that planning is really understanding this this useful life period of each asset. And so, for example, like a frontline ambulance may be expected to serve reliably for 5 or 7 years before the maintenance becomes problematic. But our station's HVAC system hopefully will last for 20 years. And so we have to account for those things differently, but always be keeping track of maybe how far away we are from having to replace those items. As fiduciary managers of our agency, we need to be tracking those life cycles to really ensure that we are prepared to replace that equipment as it ages out of service. And so we want to plan, hopefully, to replace those in a staggered way. Ideally, we don't replace our entire fleet in the same year. Of course, that's assuming we could get all those trucks in the same year. But we want to make sure we've staggered that out. And that we've set up a sinking fund where we're putting money in, we're setting it aside so that we know, hey, in a year or two, we're going to spend this money on one of those capital investments. It really is earmarked for those future purposes. And so, for example, if we know we're going to replace a $450,000 ambulance every 3 years, then every budget we should be setting aside $150,000 per year into that sinking fund. Because that's what it's going to take for us to be ready every 3 years to replace that ambulance. We always, as a board and as administrators, want to maintain that view on that 10, 20-year planning horizon so that we can really show we're being good stewards of the district's resources and funds to ensure that our agency remains sustainable, that we remain able to maintain the equipment going forward. So I want to share with you here a couple of graphics that I borrowed from Facebook because, as I said, we've got quite a few agencies that are actively educating their community about the expenses of EMS. And so I think these are really great graphics that help educate our public. And so certainly as board members, if we've been on the board for any length of time, we understand these costs and operational life cycles in EMS. We understand, hey, we have to replace a truck. And if we've got 3 trucks, those trucks last 6 years. That means every year or every other year, we're replacing an ambulance, right? And so we understand that as board members, but we also have to be educating our public about that. Facebook, social media can be a great way to do that. And so you see here, Ozark County has this graphic that really kind of breaks down some of the, and some of these definitions come from CMS, but kind of the operational life cycles of some of this really significant equipment that we have, about how long we expect our cardiac monitors should continue to function. It's not to say we don't sometimes keep them longer than that, but the goal should be to have that money set aside to be able to replace them after a certain period of time. Again, we want to be educating our public about those expenses. And so you see from the St. Francis County Ambulance has a really great graphic here, I think, that kind of breaks down how much each of those things cost. Because it may, our public, certainly we as board members know that these things are exceptionally expensive, but a LifePak monitor or a Zoll monitor may look like a fancy tablet to somebody in the lay public, and they wouldn't necessarily know that that item is very specialized in what it does and that it costs $50,000 to replace. And so, again, we can use things like social media, certainly open houses, community events, different speaking opportunities, like going to your Rotary Club, take some equipment with you, take a stretcher. Hey, this is why we have this. This is why we spend $80,000 on this really awesome stretcher with a power load system. Because, hey, if you save the cost of one work comp injury, then you have certainly gotten your money back in what you've spent on this equipment. Better for our crews, better for health, better for our patients. And so we always want to use the opportunity to educate folks on that. Education is a pretty important part of any time we're engaging in an election, and but we want to do that before the election starts, right? So if you're thinking about maybe a possible tax increase in 2027, 2028, start now. Start educating your people, your citizens today about these things, so it doesn't look like you're just coming to them at the time of the election. Um, in the state of Missouri, we do have a statute, section 115.646, that prohibits us from using public funds which includes, of course, any tax money, to support or advocate, to specifically advocate for any ballot measure. That includes a tax increase. And there are some pretty significant fines that can come along with that. And so we definitely want to be cognizant of that restriction. We cannot use public funds to expressly advocate in support of a tax increase. Does that mean we can't educate the public about it? No. We can certainly educate the public about it. We can certainly talk to our voters about why it is important that we pass a tax measure. What is going to happen if we don't have this additional funding? What consequences, what maybe will get cut? Unless we're absolutely sure that we're going to cut something, we don't want to say that, but we can certainly talk about the possibilities of what we may not be able to maintain if we don't have additional funding, what we will be able to add or improve if we have additional funding. And we can do those things on the district Facebook page. We can do them with district funds. The district can print those educational materials. We can use staff time to develop them. All of that's fine. We want to avoid the terms of express advocacy, which the United States Supreme Court has defined for us in the Buckley versus Ohio case in the late 70s. And so we want to avoid terms like vote for, which is a term of express advocacy. We are telling people how to vote. We also want to be careful with the word support, because that word support has been identified as a word of expressed advocacy. And so we just want to be very careful with those. We can certainly issue press releases. We can certainly provide information, but we want to avoid those words of express advocacy. Doesn't mean we have to remain silent. As I said, we can use our social media page. Our administrator, our board members can certainly go out and share factual information, help educate the public about the costs in EMS. The key is in providing that information that allows the voter to reach their own conclusions without directly being told how they should vote. And so we may be able to distribute a mailer out to our citizens with a photo of our 15-year-old ambulance with high mileage, talking about how often we have to repair it and how we would get a new one if the tax passes. But we don't want to put vote yes to buy a new truck on that publication, unless we've created a campaign committee. And so if we've created a campaign committee that's funded by donations, not funded by public funds, obviously they are exempt from these requirements, a completely different kettle of fish there. But if we're using district funds, we want to be limited to focusing on education. As I said, we can certainly communicate about why we need the additional funding. And so we can talk about things like, we have concerns about our response times. And with this additional funding, we can add an additional station that will reduce those response times to certain parts of our jurisdiction. We can provide those educational details. We can provide facts, but we cannot tell people how to vote for. Remember, though, this prohibition is on spending funds. There's nothing that keeps board members from attending town halls. There's nothing that keeps your administrators, your employees from attending town halls and speaking, as long as they're not on the clock, as long as they're not being paid for it, because then you're spending district funds. But board members, our employees, they all retain their right to free speech to support or oppose anything that they want to oppose. And so hopefully we don't have anybody out there opposing our ballot measures, but they retain their First Amendment right to free speech to do and talk about whatever they want to when they're not on the clock. Going back a little bit to our CIP, let's talk a little bit about fleet strategy and procurement, because again, we're looking at that 5 to 10 year period for our capital improvements, and we really want to keep that in mind with our fleets. We want our ambulance districts to follow appropriate procurement policies that really balance those requirements for operational readiness so that we can respond in an emergency, but also help us manage that duty, that fiduciary duty to our citizens. And so hopefully we have written purchase policies that really provide some of those legal safeguards. For those significant purchases, and usually I like to say anything over $15,000, but that can vary a little bit from district to district. Um, we want to set that threshold in a procurement policy. Again, it's in writing. There's no confusion about what the threshold is. And then maybe we want to say, hey, over this amount, we're going to require requests for proposals. And we're going to evaluate sealed bids. There's a process of how we're going to go about that. Our procurement policy is really going to be what defines that. Seeking requests for proposals is really not just about following this formal process, but you may find people that you didn't know were interested or offer prices or services that you didn't expect. And it's an opportunity for us to be transparent with everybody so that there's no question about why somebody got a bid and somebody did not. Especially with our fleets, we want to remember that our supply chains are better than they were 24 months ago, but they're still behind. And so it can still easily take 18 to 24 months for us to get a new chassis, to purchase a completely new ambulance. And so we have many ambulances that are using remounts now that maybe did not in the past. Of course, if you aren't familiar with a remount reuses the aluminum, that basically the patient module, the box on our ambulance from an old unit, and moves it over to a new chassis. And that can result in some pretty significant cost savings. You update the chassis, it's rewired, it's refinished, but we move that box over onto a new truck. Again, there's lots of opportunity for checking the, whoops, I'm sorry. Lots of opportunity for checking the systems in there to ensure the safety standards are made, but does allow us the chance to save some money there. It's really important for our trucks that we maintain a rotational strategy for our ambulances. And so there is a common practice, I think, used by many districts where there's a frontline to reserve rotation. And so maybe our new ambulances are placed in high volume stations or used as the first truck out until they reach a certain threshold, often 150, 200,000 miles, something like that, where then they're moved to a reserve status or to maybe a lower volume station. And there's a general recommendation just in EMS broadly, kind of a 133% fleet rule, where the district should maintain one spare unit for every 3 active units. And so certainly we have a lot of agencies that maybe don't have 3 active units. Maybe we only have 1 active unit or 2 active units. That can be an opportunity to work with your neighboring agencies, and maybe you purchase together a spare unit that, hey, it can have both logos on it. It can be emblazoned for both districts, but you have a shared unit that can help both of you save some expenses to have that backup truck, that 4th truck, that one in addition to your 3 active trucks, that really you can share as a resource that gives us the opportunity for some cost savings and the chance to work together. Sometimes in EMS, legal challenges are inevitable. And so I want to talk just briefly about sovereign immunity and director and officers insurance and some of that litigation oversight. Sovereign immunity comes to us, of course, and again, hopefully this was covered in your initial presentation, but sovereign immunity comes kind of through that idea from the common law that you cannot sue the king. For us, it says the state cannot be sued without its consent. But it grants public entities like an ambulance district immunity from many types of claims. There are exceptions for automobile accidents and dangerous conditions of property. So we still need to have liability insurance covering those. But generally, we are immune from many torts unless there is gross negligence. So that immunity is not absolute. And it protects the district as an entity. It doesn't protect the individual board members. And so that's why the director's officers insurance can be particularly important. That director and officers insurance really fills that gap where the immunity ends and can protect the assets of board members and administrators when maybe they engage in alleged wrongful acts, and so can provide them some defense assistance for things like employment disputes, discrimination claims, allegations of mismanagement of funds. It takes some of that fear of personal litigation off of EMS boards, and really just kind of protects our boards and our administrators. So would certainly encourage you to look into that director and officers insurance. Um, if you're engaged in litigation, if you get sued at some point, many times these insurance policies will appoint specialized district counsel to ensure those protections are all in place. Through EMS Legal Services, we can help you review policies and procedures. We can review those insurance policies to make sure we're not accidentally waiving sovereign immunity, which is possible, right? So we need to have riders in those contracts to make sure we're not waiving that. But generally, when litigation is triggered, we get a specially appointed defense counsel that coordinates with the insurance carrier and is very, very well experienced in litigation defense, which is kind of its own special legal area. And so we certainly want to be involved with them and keep them informed in the event we believe we're going to get sued. I do want to point out because in the Missouri Sunshine Law, there is a provision for discussing litigation in closed session. But there was a case in 2019, Wyrick versus Henry, that was pretty important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about public records. Because in that case, the district, it wasn't an ambulance district, but the political subdivision attempted to withhold records that were being requested by an individual, saying that those matters were going to be revealed in litigation. And the court clarified that that litigation exception is pretty narrow. And so it only protects legal strategy and attorney work product. Certainly, it protects discussions with your legal counsel. So you can go into closed session for that, but be very careful protecting or trying to use that provision to close business records like maintenance logs or incident reports. Again, as through our duty of obedience as board members, we have that obligation to ensure that we follow the law, that we abide by the Sunshine Law and provide that transparency when it's mandated. And so we want to just be very careful about what records we're closing under that attorney-client privilege. And so while that's definitely going to apply to things like an internal memo, not going to apply to things like incident reports. In Missouri, of course, we're looking forward to this rural health transformation program. If you haven't seen Jason White in a while, Jason's very excited about the rural health transformation because Missouri is anticipated to receive more than that number, I think, is $1 billion. I'm pretty sure I got enough zeros there. $1 billion for rural health care over the next 10 years. And so that is $1 billion that does not go to St. Louis. It doesn't go to Kansas City. It doesn't go to Jackson, Clay, Boone County, Greene County, all of those great big cities, but goes to our rural counties. And so that is going to be a significant sum of money flowing into rural healthcare. EMS is, of course, part of that. And so we want to make sure that we are prepared for those discussions. I can tell you that everybody seems to anticipate that the rural health transformation funding is most likely going to go to entities that can show they can work together with other entities. And so it won't be used to purchase a new station for a single district. But if we want to look at things like shared community paramedic programs, I think are a great opportunity for that. We really can look at this sector level collaboration to help us make a transition from what sometimes are isolated ambulance districts into really being an essential part of rural healthcare. And so some of those programs, I think that, if you have an idea for a way to share in high cost administrative or clerical or clinical personnel, that may be a great opportunity. So rather than each district struggling to fund their own clinical review officers, maybe you go in with a couple neighboring districts and you have one clinical review officer who does quality improvement for all 2, 3, 4 districts. And that's their specialty, right? Because if they can focus in on really being a great clinical review officer, and they're not also trying to manage your budget and teach your EMT program and go to every board meeting and run on the truck 40 hours a week and do CPR training for the local schools, then they can focus in on doing that job better. And we can really get some great expertise to provide that high level data analysis and protocol review that those folks need to do. Likewise, training officers are another great opportunity to collaborate with other districts. And so if you have an EMT program and your neighboring agency has an EMT program, and then the other one down the road on the other side of you has an EMT program, why not talk about how you can share one EMT instructor who can go between all three districts and really work on focusing on being a great instructor. These things can be accomplished through things like joint powers agreement or mutual aid agreements. Really give us the opportunity to collaborate in healthcare. I think that programs like that are going to be really highly looked at when we look at this rural health transformation money. And so I would encourage you as boards, as administrators, to really start thinking about how you can work with your other agencies. That's not just other ambulance districts. It can be your local, your county health departments, your county clinics, area hospitals, how we can really be an essential part of this rural health transformation. That's what this money is supposed to go to. And so how we can work with these other entities to really grow our role in pre-hospital healthcare. So just to kind of wrap up here, I know I'm almost out of time, but we just really want to kind of recap here some of the key points that we talked about. So I would encourage you before your next board meeting, or maybe at your next board meeting, say, hey, we need to schedule a special time to discuss our capital improvement plan. If we don't have one in place, let's work on getting one in place. Let's identify our next 3 to 5 years, our next 3 to 5 capital our purchases. When are we going to get new monitors? When are we going to get our next ambulance? When are we going to get power load stretchers? How are we starting to set money away in a sinking fund to make that happen so we can afford it when it gets here? We also want to audit our insurance, make sure we've got that D&O coverage for board members, make sure we've got those provisions not to waive sovereign immunity. And if we're looking at increasing our taxes or asking the voters to support that in another year or two, we're going to start planning now. We're going to start figuring out what education programs, how we can start educating our citizens today about our needs in the future. And then we want to figure out ways to discuss collaboration to really preserve the future of our district. So there's a lot of discussion about consolidation of ambulance districts, but guys, if we can work together, we don't have to consolidate, right? We have to find ways to be more efficient, to save costs, but we can do that without giving up our individual identity as districts. But it means that we have to work together. It means we can't go, well, I love working with everybody else, but not that ambulance district to the south because I don't like that director and they're a frustration to me every time I work with them. Securing our future requires collaboration. It requires working together. And we have to figure out as boards and as administrators how to make that happen. And so we really want to work on doing that. I would definitely encourage you to be having those discussions and discuss how we can work together to get that rural health transformation money, because that can be huge for EMS in Missouri. So there is my contact information. If anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You're always welcome to give me a call. That's my cell phone number. You can call or text me. That's also my email address. Hang on just a second. Don't anybody log off because I have to, I'm going to end this screen sharing and I have to stop the screen share apparently before I can do the survey. And so before we take any questions, I'm going to push this survey out there that I did figure out how to do a minute ago, but now it's gone from me. Because there it is. So I'm going to launch the survey. It's got 7 simple questions. Please fill those out, answer that information, and then we will get that. That gives me an email to be able to send your certificate to. So please fill that out before you leave. And with that, if anybody has any questions, I did see somebody put something in the Q&A. So, uh, Frank, I want to make sure I understood what you had said. If we have an employee who also serves on a fire district board, are they not able to be an actual employee for the district, or is that just serving on more than one board? So you cannot be an employee of an ambulance district and serve on the board of a fire protection district. That is different if you have a fire department, but you cannot, under 321 017, there is a prohibition from being an employee of one district and serving on the board of another, or being on the board of more than one district. Of course, you'd have to be in fire and EMS, right? Because there's not going to be any overlapping EMS districts. But you can't be on more than one board, and you cannot be an employee of one and serve on the board of another. If you have more specific questions about that, please let me know. As I said, there's a statutory prohibition on that. That's not to say that it does not happen throughout the state of Missouri, because sometimes, especially in rural communities, there are a limited number of people who are interested in emergency services, and so oftentimes they may work in it and then want to volunteer on the board, but there's just that prohibition in 321.017. Can you guys see the survey, hopefully?
Sir.
Okay, awesome. I just want to make sure you could see it.
Do you need a title for it?
Okay, well, somebody could see it because somebody filled it out. So, all right. And if anybody else has any other questions, I'll be happy to answer questions. Otherwise, I will end the recording and then just give you guys some time to finish out that survey.
Frank, this is Jerry Appleton from Rock Township.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Look what you're typing.
New truck, Rick, with gun. Read the question. Can't read, it's too small.
I know, but look at your answer. It doesn't-
No, they're all true because the platform goes this.
Okay, I'm going to mute Michael because I think he's having a side conversation. Jerry, did you have a question?
I did. Just real quick on this rural health transformation money that you spoke of. Are there geographical restrictions being titled rural health? Does that kind of eliminate some of us that are a little more urban or suburban?
So it does eliminate some of the urban areas. I'm not sure if Rock Township. What county are you in with?
We're in Jefferson County.
Jefferson County. Okay, I think Jefferson may be one that's not in it, but don't quote me on that. I know there are counties in there that would not necessarily think would be in there. And I think they're just, like Jackson and Clay, St. Louis County, Boone County. I don't know. I'm not for sure if Jefferson's in there. I can look that up and get back with you on that.
I can do a little more research further, and then if I got any questions, I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Sure. I know. So they are still working on the map. I wish they had the map. I definitely would have shared that because what they're going to do is divide the state into, I think, 6 or 9 geographical regions. And then within each of those regions, there'll be like 30 hubs or something like that. When that's done, I think that will give us a good idea of maybe who it would be good to talk about working together, right? If you're right on the line and your neighbors in the neighboring region, it might not be as helpful to go in with them on a project. But I apparently there was a draft of the map, and then of course politics got in the middle of it, and so that draft is now gone. But I know there will be a map that will divide up those regions and hopefully give us a little bit more information there. But I'll check on Jefferson County for you, Chief.
I appreciate you. Thank you, sir.
Let's see. Michael asked, is there any new information on the timeline for the rural health transformation money? We have a plan with our local hospital. That's excellent. And health department, we're unsure of what the next steps are. So, Michael, they're still, as I just mentioned, they're still working on that map. So there are no applications out there yet, but I would expect that to be within the next couple months. This is something that I think the federal government has mandated. It's a ridiculously fast timeline. I believe they're supposed to have basically start dispersing the money by the end of the summer, and then looking for results in the fall. So it will be moving fast. Definitely. I'm assuming, Michael, that you're on my email blast. As I get that, I will send that out. I know Jason White will be pushing that information out as well. But I don't have any specific dates about it. I just know it is hopefully coming very soon. Jacob Bronner, how would you best advise districts to address cyber liability? Far too often, there's no cyber liability coverage, and unwillingness to pay for separate cyber liability policy due to the cost compared to including it in the package policy. So, Jacob, that's a great question. Cyber liability is certainly kind of a new and evolving area for liability for EMS. We obviously have a lot of electronic records. All of our PCRs now are electronic. All of that patient information and billing is an opportunity for some significant liability. So if there's something like a HIPAA breach, you can have some very severe liability for the district. So I think that is definitely a good thing to be in discussion with your insurance agent about, and to look at the cost of that. I think cyber liability can be very concerning for districts, and so I would definitely encourage you to look at limiting your liability either through a rider on your existing policy or an entirely separate policy. I think that is a good area to address as well through insurance. Thank you for that question. Blake says, am I always technically on duty as a salaried employee? And so can I say yes on voting for a tax when I'm not at work? I don't ever get to have a beer with Blake, but hopefully he's not on duty when we're having a beer, right? So I would say certainly district administrators obviously are many times salaried employees. There are occasions you're not on the clock, and so I don't have any concern with district administrators going outside of their normal working hours and talking to the public or presenting that information. I don't think you're using up the district's time to do that, because you are still fulfilling all of your other obligations and responsibilities to the district. But although you are salaried and there are maybe specific hours, and you may essentially be always on the clock, I don't think we're spending any additional public funds by you doing that additional work. And certainly you retain your right as an individual for free speech. And so I don't have concerns about administrators as long as they're not taking the whole week to go knock on doors and not doing things in the office, about adding some additional work and going out and helping educate the public on the importance of those tax measures. Jason says, do you plan on having a class presentation on planning on possible future without property taxes for districts? And so, yes, Jason. So I don't know if you've been to one of these webinars before, but I try to do these about every other month. And typically I will try after the legislative session is done in May. I sometimes just do a special one about what passed legislatively. As I said, there's a whole lot of bills that are filed, and some moving, some not, dealing with property taxes, and what property taxes may look like in the future in Missouri. Certainly, I think once the dust settles on that a little bit, because I haven't even read all of them. There's just so many out there, but certainly once some of them pass, I definitely think there'll be a good opportunity, maybe late May or 1st of June, to talk about how that property tax may be changing based on what laws actually come to fruition there. So thank you, though. That is a great question. Definitely something I'd be happy to follow up about. Autumn asks, what are your thoughts about the district placing information in the local paper for a tax levy? As long as these are information only, can the district pay for these ads to be published? Yes, as long as you're doing educational material, then you can certainly pay to have it put in the paper. You just want to be very careful about avoiding those words of express advocacy. So vote for and support Vote for is pretty easy to avoid. Support can end up in there without us really knowing about it too easily. So just be careful with the language. But if you're presenting information in a fair and educational way, then I would not have any concern about paying to have it in the newspaper. Just like you can pay to have flyers printed, right? You're spending those public funds for educational reasons, but not to specifically endorse or tell people how to vote in a certain way. So thank you, Autumn. That's a great question. Okay, I think I said a while ago I was going to turn off the recording. Now I'm actually going to turn off the recording.